Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history. And in this week, we are looking at an episode in British political history that was suggested to us by one of our subscribers on our Patreon or however you say it, Daniel Swain, who thought that we ought to look at the poll tax, one of the contributing events that is said to have led to the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership in 1990. Was that in fact the case? What was the poll tax? And was it really such a bad policy? Lee and I will discuss.
Yes, we thought this was a really good topic to discuss, actually, because the poll tax in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we should say this is not the 14th century version that we're discussing today.
We might mention that a little bit later on, though.
But very much the 20th century, it's really become one of the iconic examples of policy failure in British politics. In some ways, it's almost the domestic equivalent of the Suez Crisis. If you're reaching for a policy that is perceived to be a blunder, then people will often refer to the poll tax.
What we're talking about here fundamentally is perhaps a rather unsexy topic, but one that touches us all, which is local government financing. And basically, how do we as residents contribute to the funding of local government services? So what was the system of local government financing in Britain before the poll tax? So take us to the 1970s and 80s.
If we zoom out to begin with and basically ask some questions about how do we fund government services in this country, well, for local government, I think the answer that most people would give is that it is now, and it has historically been, a bit of a mess. I'd almost say it's like when you go to the beach and you sometimes see those piles of rocks that are precariously balanced, but somehow they're holding their shape and holding their definition. You look at that and you can think, gosh, I don't know how that works, but it does work. And I think the way in which local government finances have often been seen is that we can't really easily understand or explain how they work, but they do the fundamental job of channeling sufficient money into local government funds that provide basic local government services.
But to carry the metaphor on, if you tinker with that pile of stones, then the whole thing might collapse. And I suppose that's part of the hesitancy as well with reforming local government finance.
Correct. And this is basically a story of how do those pile of rocks come tumbling down in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The system that the poll tax sought to replace was the system that was known as rates, business rates and domestic rates. Now, business rates, of course, we still have. There's been a great controversy in recent months over a reevaluation of business rates, which has seen many pubs and hospitality businesses whacked with massive tax bills that's putting them under enormous pressure. But alongside business rates were domestic rates. And these were actually the easiest way to think about them in some senses, if we jump forward a little, is fairly similar to council tax in that they were based on households. They varied depending upon the value of the asset that was being taxed, and they were pretty unpopular. The rates was not a popular model of local government taxation. It was that fundamental unpopularity of rates as a means of taxation that caused the Thatcher government to look at ways to reform it. But it wasn't just that. It was actually a deeper sense that the system was so confused and so many people basically did not know how much or the ways in which they were contributing towards paying the domestic rates. The totemic figure, really, of that is that in the mid-1980s, about 60% of people were not receiving a bill for domestic rates. So sometimes they would pay it because it was built into their rent. Sometimes they were part of a household where somebody else paid it. But the big concern was that basically local government was being funded by this Gordian knot of arrangements, which basically separated the funding of local government from the delivery of local government, from accountability for how that money was spent and how much of it was spent and what the outcomes of it were. And that was a big factor, really, in looking at reforming this.
I'm going to push back a little bit on some of that. I think some of that is mild Thatcherite propaganda of a certain sort. I mean, so the rate system is you have the business rates, you say, and you have domestic rates. And domestic rates, every household gets a bill. And the bill is calculated on the basis of the rentable value of that property. Now, there were problems with that because the valuation was based on valuations that were done in 1973. And so by the time you get to the mid to late 1980s, you're judging something on the basis of what its rentable value was 15 years earlier. I should say council tax at the moment runs under a similar but slightly different system where every household gets a bill. That bill is calculated based on the value of that house in the early 1990s, or what the projected value of that house would have been if it existed in the 1990s. And people are put into different bands. Now, in those days, you weren't put into different bands. It was just effectively there was a multiplier based on the value of your house. It sounds somewhat complicated, but I mean, basically, it means that every household is being sent a bill based on the extractable value of that house. And this 60% figure, I think, is somewhat propagandistic because every household got one with small exceptions. So if you lived in a furnished, rented property, as I did when I was a graduate student, for example, I had a private landlord who provided a house where there was already a bed and a kitchen table and settee and so on. The domestic rate bill would have gone to my landlord. And then the landlord could claim that back in effect by integrating that into the rent. Some councils, if you lived in a council house, would integrate the cost of your domestic rates into your rent, your social rent for your council house or council flat. But that wasn't uniform, and that was somewhat idiosyncratic. And actually, by the 1980s, most councils were delinking them, so people would literally get their bill, even if they were council tenants. There were a series of rebates that people would get, their rates rebates based on if they were, it was basically means tested, so based on their income or in some cases particular statuses of population like students and pensioners would get some money back. But as systems of local financing go, I don't think on the face of it, it was quite as absurd a system as many of the Thatcher ministers made out.
Certainly, it wasn't a system without any merit. I think part of what frustrated a lot of Conservatives, though, it was a system in which people who Margaret Thatcher may have described as our people were often clobbered.
I mean, it just seems to me that basically they didn't like it because people who lived in posh homes that were worth quite a lot and therefore had a high evaluated rate of rentable income paid more. I think that's quite fair.
Well, it wouldn't be right to say that's the only thing that people objected to. People also objected, for example, that there were incentives for people who don't necessarily contribute to put political pressure on the people who run these councils to whack up the rates for the people who did contribute. So, in fact, it was seen that lots of the time those taxes were going up and up and up. This was not a time of tightly regulated, certainly for most of this period, local government taxation like we have now. So it was seen that the people who can pay would be squeezed to pay more and more and more. And the political pressure to bring that about could be driven by people who barely have to contribute to the system at all. That was a big part of the critique of it anyway. And that critique actually had quite a long lineage in the Conservative Party.
So I mentioned that the valuation was based on a valuation done in 1973, and then the policy basically got stuck for 25 years. And part of the reason for that is because the Conservative Party had for a long time wanted to replace the domestic rate system, basically a kind of progressive system, with a less progressive system. Take us back to those discussions in the 1970s when that debate has been had.
The key period here is the months between the February and the October 1974 general elections. After the defeat in February 1974, Ted Heath, who remained Conservative leader, made Margaret Thatcher Shadow Environment Secretary. And in the middle of 1974, Margaret Thatcher was the star of a Conservative Party political broadcast in which she made a whole series of pledges, really quite dramatic pledges actually, about housing. She starts with an admission that the last Conservative government did not get housing policy right. It's pretty essential when you've lost an election a few months earlier to make some sort of concession like that. And she proposes, among other policies, capping mortgage interest rates at 9.5%. That's seen as being a really quite a remarkable offer to the public, where there's fear that interest rates are going to go up more and more and more. She also proposes a scheme which would help people to save for deposit to buy a house, not totally dissimilar from some of the schemes that we've seen in recent years that I've often associated with George Osborne. But for this purpose, the other thing that she pledges in that party political address is that the Conservatives will abolish the existing system of rates. And she says, and in general terms here, I think we ought to push back against your idea, Richard, that it would necessarily be less progressive, because you don't necessarily see that in what she says. Her words are, "There's no doubt that the present system of rates is both old-fashioned and increasingly unfair. Local authorities have been spending at a faster rate than the economy has been growing. Rates often have nothing to do with what you can afford to pay or the services you receive. We will get rid of the present system for household rates altogether, replace it with a different system of taxes that relates to what people can afford to pay. That must be fairer all round." A couple of things are really key there. The one that I'll particularly draw attention to is she doesn't just talk about a different tax, she talks about a different system of taxes for local government. So the way in which this is being thought about within the Conservative Party, and I think more broadly at the time, is that you have the rates model, business and domestic. But actually, if we're to find ways to replace it, we may have to be much, much more creative about how to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a rich irony if that's what she was suggesting in the 1970s, that then the policy that arrives is the poll tax, which has absolutely no relation to people's ability to pay. Now, of course, a more direct way to measure people's ability to pay would be to tax their income. But a proxy, I suppose, for that is the value of the house. And I don't think it's, as Margaret Thatcher describes in her broadcast, that it's totally detached from people's ability to pay, where under the rate system, if you lived in a big house, you paid more. If you were of low income in a big house, then there were rebates that were given to you to account for that, for example. But that was the system, more or less. So you mentioned, Lee, that the Conservatives were going to explore potential alternatives to domestic rates in a more comprehensive way. So did they look at things like a local income tax, for example?
I think the common theme that emerges really is that it's a little bit like talking about social care and reforming social care in this country. As soon as you start talking about the replacement, things suddenly get very, very complicated. The first attempt under the Conservative government after 1979, the beginning of Margaret Thatcher's 11 and a half years in office, to really think seriously about domestic rates, comes in 1981, when a green paper called, creatively enough, Alternatives to Domestic Rates was published. And this was announced by the responsible minister, one Michael Heseltine, in the House of Commons. And that considers basically a whole range of different ways to potentially fund local government. I'll read part of what Heseltine said in the Commons. "The Green Paper considers first the main requirements to be met by any revenue-raising system for local government. Against those requirements, it discusses, first, domestic rates, and then the most promising alternatives: local sales tax, local income tax, poll tax, and assigned exchequer revenues." Some of those things in there are very familiar to some international listeners. Things like a local sales tax or a local income tax will not be alien concepts to people who live in large parts of the United States, for example, but are pretty alien to Britain and Britain's system of funding local government. But they are things that are very much put on the table in the early 1980s. This does provoke a bit of controversy, in part for that very reason, that if you were to introduce some of these things, yes, you might be abolishing one form of unpopular taxation. But again, rather like in the social care analogy, where it's not the bit you're abolishing that's tricky, it's what you're replacing it with. You'd be replacing it with new taxes, new taxes being created by a Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher. And she rather then takes against this idea. So there were some papers in the National Archives which shows some of the internal discussions going on in government about these options that are proposed in the Green Paper. And lots of different government ministers who are on this respective internal committee make their own recommendations. And the one that wins the argument is put forward by the Home Secretary, Willie Whitelaw. We did a bonus podcast on him some time ago with one half of his official biographer, Mark Garnett, which is available on the Patreon. Willie Whitelaw was a hugely important figure behind the scenes in shaping and shepherding the policy of government during most of the Thatcher years. And he suggests that the government should drop consideration of all alternatives to the present system of domestic rates, except for the idea of just reforming the rate system itself. And it's one of those very nice things about looking at archive papers. You can see in Margaret Thatcher's very distinctive handwriting at the bottom, so distinctive that you can't read all of it as it happens. But she writes, "I am totally underlined, against, underlined, a local income tax." And at that stage, those ideas for reform really begin to fade away.
I find her objection to a local income tax rather puzzling, given what she had said in the 1974 broadcast. If what she had thought was so unfair about the domestic rate system is that it was not tightly enough tied to people's ability to pay, then why would you be totally against the system that is most closely aligned with people's ability to pay? It seems a rather puzzling position for her to take. And it suggests to me that her objection to the domestic rate system is not actually about people's ability to pay, but it's about curbing local government spending. I think that's really what this comes to.
Of course, that's a huge factor during this time, the desire to curb rampant local government spending. You can hear that in the 1974 address. The other thing is just worth saying on this is, again, we've done an episode on the 1981 budget, which is a tax rising budget that comes during a recession, mercifully at the end of the recession. And so this is all now being considered at a time in which the Conservatives are already raising tax and the economy has not been seen to do particularly well in the early years of the Thatcher government. It would be a really inopportune time, given the way in which she has pitched herself politically, to suddenly be inventing new levels of taxation that would then be levied on people.
But really, I think what she's objecting to is that she doesn't want Labour councils to be spending on things that she doesn't believe are worthwhile. And that, I think, contributes to local government tax reforms of her government, which is the Rates Act 1984.
Yes, so having abandoned the idea of total comprehensive reform, they look instead to the idea of capping or putting a ceiling on the increases in rates. So they passed the Rates Act 1984, as you mentioned, and using that law, 31 councils had their ability to raise rates restricted. All but one of them were Labour-run councils. And this was used as part of the fight against Militant in Liverpool in the mid-1980s, and also as part of a major fight against Lambeth Council, which was a Labour-run council that has often been one of the bogeymen for figures on the right when talking about out-of-control local government. And in fact, the leader of Lambeth Council, Ted Knight, was in the end prosecuted under this act for his refusal to follow its requirements and banned from office for 10 years. The reason why we mention all this as a prelude to talking about the poll tax is really to establish a couple of points in mind. One of them is that this thought process about how to get rid of the rates and what to replace them with has been gestating for years within the Conservative Party, decades, arguably, by the time the ideas for the poll tax really begin to take shape. And secondly, that this comes within a context over many years in the 1980s of the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher trying, A, going to war with some parts of local government, particularly Labour-run councils it deemed out of control, and B, seeking to try and restrict spending at local authority level in any ways it can, in part related back to one of the very earlier points that we made, because it did not feel that there was strong enough accountability over local government decision makers about the rates of tax and the levels of spending in their council areas.
And actually, this story about local government financing and the rows over it go much further back. In the 1920s, Poplar Council, which was a Labour council, was complaining that the amount of income that they could generate from their rates was not adequate to meet the need in their borough. And I think this goes to one of those fundamental problems I have with the whole kind of reliance on local areas financing local services, is that rich areas that are either low population or low need or both can lavish their local income on very high quality services because they don't have as much demand on them. And areas that have high population but low wealth and higher need have much fewer resources to spend on a population that needs them more. And the argument in Poplar in the 1920s was, we are applying rates that are actually higher than the rates in West London, we're in East London, and we're getting much, much less revenue for our poorer population. So in that case, what happened in Poplar was the councillors refused to give their share of what were called the precepts to different other parts of government. They just held them back and spent them in the local area. And 30 councillors were sent to prison. And one of them, the daughter-in-law of George Lansbury, actually died as a result of her time in prison because she got pneumonia. This whole story is one where, personally speaking, I think the consistent left-wing argument is actually either you have a system where you have your local rates massively topped up through a redistributive grant system, or actually you just collect most of the finance centrally and then redistribute it according to need. But that is not the argument that's being made by the Conservatives in the 1980s, nor is indeed the argument that's often made on the left today, when, for whatever reason, you hear preachers on the left of British politics talk about the wonders of devolution, even though, in my view, devolution means inequality necessarily, and that inequality is that poverty is kept in poorer areas and wealth is kept in wealthier areas.
That is the unavoidable outcome of fiscal autonomy for local areas. I wanted to come on to talk about the announcement of the policy as official Conservative policy. And I mentioned at the outset that the poll tax, or the community charge, to give it its formal name, is not a policy blunder in the way that many recent, say, policy blunders are. So if you take two of the biggest, most controversial decisions, fiscally relatively small, we ought to say, but in terms of impact and public reaction, two of the biggest policy decisions made by this Labour government. The original proposals to dramatically reduce the winter fuel payments and what is called by its critics, it's a term I would certainly use, the family farm tax. These are both policies that very few people in the House of Commons knew about when the Chancellor announced them. They were not in Labour's manifesto. They were not widely touted beforehand. Even most of the ministers in the departments that will ultimately be responsible for them will not necessarily have known about them until Rachel Reeves announced them in the Commons. And that lack of buy-in at an early stage of policymaking in those areas is one of the big problems that triggered such a backlash, including among Labour MPs, not just the wider public. That is not the case for the poll tax. This was a manifesto commitment. The 1987 Conservative Manifesto said, quote, "We will reform local government finance to strengthen local democracy and accountability. Local electors must be able to decide the level of service they want and how much they are prepared to pay for it. We will legislate in the first session of the new Parliament to abolish the unfair domestic rating system and replace rates with a fairer community charge. This will be a fixed rate charge for local services paid by those over the age of 18, except the mentally ill and elderly people living in homes and hospitals. The less well-off students will not have to pay the full charge, but everyone will be aware of the costs as well as the benefits of local services. This should encourage people to take a greater interest in the policies of their local council and getting value for money." So that's in the manifesto. It was literally there in black and white. And this is an election that Margaret Thatcher wins by a landslide. This gets a majority of 100. And Neil Kinnock, it's his first time fighting a general election as Labour leader, gets trounced. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about this story. It wasn't a bolt from the blue that suddenly shocked the public and provoked a massive reaction. Anybody who was, put bluntly, paying attention knew that this was going to be coming in the new Parliament.
And as you say, Lee, there was an even longer lead up to this that discussions had been had since the mid 1970s. There was this Green Paper in 1981, so before even the 1983 election. And then you have the 1987 election, and it's now pretty clearly in the manifesto, and it's not, as some manifesto commitments are, written in such a vague and abstract way that no one really knows what it means, but to say that there will be a fixed rate charge for local services does pretty much reveal what the government's plans were. And it is, I think, one of the great strengths of the British Constitution that we have this norm and expectation that if you're going to put major policy change through in the Parliament to come, that you put it in your manifesto and you get elected on a majority to deliver it. But the curious thing is we call it the poll tax, not the community charge. And this is a clever bit of branding from the opponents of the legislation. So the poll tax has its roots way back in medieval English history. As you mentioned, Lee, goes right back to the 14th century. In the 14th century, my namesake, Richard II, became king in 1377. He was just 10 years old at the time. And the men who were really running the country, like his uncle, John o' Gaunt, brought in a poll tax, which was a tax levied on pretty much every adult male in the country, regardless of how rich or poor they were. And this revenue was used to finance war with France during the Hundred Years' War. And in 1381, a craftsman called Wat Tyler organized a march of the sort of bourgeoisie, shall we say, craftspeople of Kent and Essex, and they marched into London and they met the king in Mile End, where Queen Mary University is now located. And at Mile End, Tyler and Richard II had a confrontation. Wat Tyler was killed the following day. Richard II, now 14, I think, announces, "I am your captain now," to the peasants, as they were seen, although they were actually probably a bit wealthier than peasants. And they dispersed. Nonetheless, the government did roll back the poll tax, as it was so unpopular and was obviously provoking riots and disruption in the kingdom. So that history, which today is perhaps a little obscure, although I think it should be better known than it is, and I think maybe in the 1980s, when maybe there was a little bit more rigorous teaching of certain elements of English history, the Peasants' Revolt, I think, probably would have been more widely known, became a very effective form of branding, because in a sense, the community charge, which was a tax now not based on your income, not based on the value of your home, but based on you being a human being living in that local authority, no matter how rich or poor you were, sounded to many people quite similar to the poll taxes of the 14th century.
Yes, and as much as the government might try throughout this period to refer to the community charge, the words poll tax was on everyone's lips. In the late 1980s, the Department for the Environment, who was tasked with implementing this, put together a booklet called The Community Charge, How It Will Work for You. Well, though after the words community charge, they inserted in parentheses the so-called poll tax. So even in the government's official brochures about this, they had to concede the term poll tax because that was literally what everybody was calling it. Before we come on to the specifics of how it was to be implemented, I think we should probably talk a little bit about the principle of it, because it is, Richard, linked into the deeply historic points that you made just then. The idea that a poll tax is unfair, that is often used as the most strident criticism of this policy. An idea that we'll now probably refer to again, but that was often used at the time. Even Margaret Thatcher referred to this in her private notes, is that a duke and a dustman would pay the same. And that really grates against a lot of people, and they see that as being deeply unfair. I'll offer my general view on it in a moment, but if I was to defend the principle of what is being done or was proposed with the poll tax, for the vast majority of things that people buy, the price does not vary depending on their ability to pay. If a multimillionaire and a pauper both go into the Tesco down the road, their shopping, if they buy the same items, costs the same, irrespective of their ability to pay. Same is true if people with similarly divergent finances go into a bookshop or a car dealership. And the principle that was being applied with the poll tax was the idea that, well, that should also apply to things like bin collection. Now, if the principle that people with very different incomes ought to pay the same for the same services is so monstrous, and we have much, much bigger issues with the political economy of almost every country on the earth than we think, because it is basically what happens almost all of the time. Now, those who are steeped in Marxist theory and critics of capitalism will say, well, that is one of the great failings of capitalism. They're, of course, entitled to think that. But it is basically the way the system works at the moment. And this was basically saying, not that Britain would become a flat tax nation, but that so far as it applies to local government taxation, that it would basically be a flat tax, in part because the services that people use are the same. But on top of that, and this was a big factor in many people's minds at the time, because if you have gradations of what people have to pay, so that people who are well off pay much more than people who are less well off, then the problem that a lot of people diagnose with the rate system, i.e., a lot of people don't pay in very much, a lot of people pay a great deal, the people who don't contribute as much can put democratic pressure on councillors to spend more on services at the expense of somebody else, basically gets diminished. So you lose some of the accountability, the direct accountability of people are paying varying amounts into the local government system. Now, for what it's worth, my view, my personal view, is that whilst you can make that argument, the problem with it is that we do use the way in which the government levies taxes as a means of redistribution in this country. So we do ask those who are more able to pay to contribute more to general services, even if they get less out of them themselves. And I think that is one of the ways in which, as a country and as a civilized country, we smooth some of the hard edges of capitalism to make it a more tolerable system for people who live in this country. And the idea, therefore, of a flat tax would have been a bad idea.
This shows to me how this was effectively an ideologically driven tax reform. It is an argument for effectively flat taxes rather than a progressive tax system. Yes, we do have some flat taxes, for example, the value-added tax, but historically that was something that the left in this country resisted. I mean, the reason we have VAT is actually partly a consequence of us joining the European community. And it was a requirement of EEC and then EU membership to have value-added tax on most consumable goods with some exemptions. Historically, and that was actually, if you go back and look at the debates from Labour Eurosceptics, one of the sets of debates the Labour Eurosceptics made was we mustn't go into the common market because we have the freedom to exempt many more things from consumption taxes, because we know that consumption taxes are generally unfair, at least taxes on day-to-day consumables. There's a different argument about luxury goods being taxed. And that was basically the Labour argument, is when we're out of the EU, we can tax luxury goods, but we won't tax most of the things that you buy when you go proverbially down to Tesco. And so the position from the left is that the tax system that we want to see is that the people with the broadest shoulders, i.e. those who have the biggest incomes and the highest wealth, are the ones who should bear the biggest burden. And those who are less wealthy in society should pay less into the exchequer. But from the perspective of the right of politics, from the perspective of the Conservatives, they're much more sympathetic to the argument that you shouldn't tax success, as they would see it, and that everyone should be required to make effectively some kind of common contribution. And that's, to me, that's part of where this poll tax is coming out of.
The challenge to that, though, is that by the time the policy was actually being implemented, the government and Margaret Thatcher had conceded the point around fairness, mostly because Margaret Thatcher was, I think, actually quite shook by the way in which quite a lot of the people, the voters, who she always thought were her people, and people who had voted for her quite consistently, hated this policy. as it began to get implemented and felt that it was unfair. And so some of the ways in which the effects of it were mitigated, for example, if you were unemployed or a student, you would only pay 20% of the rate of the poll tax in your area rather than the full amount. Later, she would propose to John Major, when he was Chancellor, surcharges for higher earners to try and create some discrepancy actually between what people were paying based on their ability to pay, while they're going back to the language of the 1974 announcement rather than what was first proposed in the late 1980s. I think the key point to really make on this, and this is one of the ways in which the quite narrow but coherent intellectual arguments for the poll tax, flawed in lots of other respects, including morally, but the arguments that were made for it in and of itself began to come undone, is that the argument that it was unfair was conceded, and therefore lots of different compromises and ameliorations were being made to the way in which the poll tax worked, which actually stripped it somewhat further away from the way in which it was originally intended to work.
So the Conservative government was good on its word in its 1987 manifesto and passes the legislation in that first session of Parliament. Walk us through a bit, Lee, how the community charge is actually implemented. Because unlike some other policies that we've seen under the Starmer government that have been announced and then collapse, in many of those cases, that happens before they actually go into effect. Whereas in this case, the community charge did go into effect. They got the legislation through and people were actually paying it. So how did that all work?
Yeah, so after the election, like you say, the legislation was passed. Most of the cabinet were on board with it. Nigel Lawson is a notable dissenter in that he was not a fan of the idea. He thought it would be politically toxic. But it began to be implemented in 1989 and would basically be introduced over a couple of years. So in 1989, the poll tax took effect in Scotland. One of the reasons for focusing on Scotland first was that this was a way to try and test run the policy in a sense and to implement it somewhat incrementally. Reforming local government taxation in this way was pretty unwieldy. It relied upon having records of the people who were living in an area, literally the people who would be taxed. It required upon setting up the infrastructure for those people to pay their taxation. That would be distinct from the way it was historically done under rates. It required, of course, determining what the rate would be for each particular area. And because that was seen as being quite cumbersome, Scotland got it first. Now, this was one of the big mistakes, I think, of the way in which the poll tax was introduced, because it fed in to an idea of Scottish nationalist grievance and entered the mythology, I think, of Scottish nationalism in a way that's never really been dislodged. It also, longer term, fed into the arguments for devolution and created this perception in many people's minds that there was a lack of democratic legitimacy around the governing arrangements of the United Kingdom, because Scotland had this deeply unpopular policy in Scotland and the rest of the UK imposed on it from a government that did not have a majority of the seats in Scotland and without obvious democratic consent in Scotland. And so, I say, this was a big, big blunder. Now, that is not a view that is consistent with what was at the time the unitary state of the United Kingdom that governs on behalf of all parts of the United Kingdom. But that certainly fed into a lot of the arguments that would build into the 1990s around devolution and, of course, lead to the creation of a Scottish Parliament at the end of that decade. And Scotland became one of the epicenters for mass civil disobedience and resentment around the poll tax.
And I think what people remember about the poll tax, insofar as they remember it, is the scale of public unrest that you saw on the streets of not just Scotland, but England and Wales as well. People talk about the poll tax riots and how this contributed to the end of Thatcher. So tell us a little bit about what were the poll tax riots, what was the scale of them, and did they have any influence on the survival of the policy or indeed of Margaret Thatcher's premiership?
It's a very interesting question. I think the way I'll try and offer some thoughts on that is to say we have this general category of civil disobedience around the policy of the poll tax. There are groups like the 3Ds that are set up don't register, don't pay, don't collect, that are basically telling people to resist the implementation.
And when they say don't register, they mean don't register to vote because they're using the electoral register as the way to identify individuals for the tax.
Yes, there's a longer run consequence of this around electoral rolls for sure. There's things like the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation, and these groups are basically organised to try and protest and resist it. Now, I think, for my money, the civil disobedience aspect of that, i.e. do not comply with the system, goes right to the heart of why the policy eventually fails. Now, there are some local authorities where it's said that 30% of people are basically refusing to pay the poll tax. And it's very hard to enforce the law in a situation like that, realistically. The police can't handle all those cases, nor can the courts, nor can councils. You can't lock all those people up. This is true for other policies now, by the way. I mean, policies like taxation do depend upon the vast, vast majority of people complying with them, because we do not have the breadth of law and order to enforce it if there is a mass rebellion, realistically. And that is not an appeal for people to try and not pay their taxes en masse. We obviously should do so, but realistically, there's only so much the state can do if people don't. So there's that side of it, which I think is really quite effective. And it's worth saying is effective outside of the auspices of the Labour Party, the official opposition in this country. The Labour Party chooses not to support a policy of non-payment of the poll tax at its 1988 conference. But nevertheless, these groups that sit outside of it, and some of the groups that have in the past been in it and somewhat difficult within it, like Militant, are supporting these movements. The second aspect of civil disobedience is the one that you ask about, which I actually think is rather less consequential, and that's the big protests and at times the violent protests we called as riots. The most dramatic one is in Trafalgar Square, what culminates in Trafalgar Square in March 1990. It's a bit of an open question as to how many people were there, but certainly tens of thousands. Some people say up to 200,000 people were all told involved in the protest. Throughout the day, 340 people were arrested, 113 people were injured, over 100 police officers were injured, over 100 premises were damaged as well in this central part of London. And this, of course, posed big questions about the policy. The reason why I don't think it was necessarily that consequential is that these were not the first riots that Margaret Thatcher ever experienced as Prime Minister. Of course, it had happened before. She knew that basically the centre ground of public opinion in this country was not on the side of mobs setting fire to cars in Trafalgar Square. She knew that she did not need those people, or the people who sympathised with those people, to be on her side in order to govern the country or to win elections. The doubt I think that it put in her mind and others was that, well, it's one thing to have mass protests against a policy that plenty of people in the country support, but all of the polling evidence suggested this was actually a deeply unpopular policy with pretty much everyone. Nobody really liked the poll tax, including lots of historic Conservative supporters. So then the rationale changed slightly to, well, yes, people aren't going to be on the side of the mob, but if you've got a mob and actually the public sympathise with the core argument of the mob, even if not what they're actually doing, then, well, is it really worth having this fight?
Just on your earlier point about the Labour Party's role in all of this. So, as you say, it was from 1988 Labour Party policy not to engage in non-payment. So, not to take the view that councils, say in Liverpool, had taken about basically setting illegal budgets, or not to return to popularism of the 1920s, where councils didn't pay what they needed to pay to other levels of government. However, there were individual Labour MPs who did adopt personally a policy of non-payment. The most prominent, I think, of these is Tony Benn, who initially refused to pay the community charge. Eventually he did when he was ordered to do so by the courts. But there was another Labour MP, Terry Fields, who was a Liverpool MP, who was associated with Militant, and he was eventually expelled from the Labour Party due to his association with Militant, who said that he couldn't afford to pay the community charge. And you might think, well, why could an MP not afford to pay this charge? And that was because Terry Fields had always given away all of his parliamentary salary that was above what his previous salary had been before he was elected to Parliament, where he was a fireman. So he used to give that to unions and charities and also to Militant quite to be quite honest. So he always described himself as an MP on a worker's wage. And he, unlike Ben, didn't fold when he was ordered to pay by the court. And as a result, he spent 2 months in prison for non-payment for the community charge. But that was very unhelpful for the Labour Party's perspective. Neil Kinnock wanted Labour to be seen as respectable. He said that lawmakers shall not be lawbreakers. And as I said, ultimately Terry Fields was kicked out of the Labour Party anyway because of his associations with Militant. So if Lee, you don't think that the poll tax riots pushed Thatcher out or contributed to her demise, were there other pressures being put on her politically, maybe closer to home within the Tory party, for example, as a result of the poll tax?
Yeah, so the internal pressure became huge, actually, especially from Conservative MPs who had mailbags that were just overwhelmed with correspondence from people who now knew what their poll tax would be. So by early 1990, people knew what the tax would be in England and Wales as it was about to be introduced. And for most people, their bills soared. In fact, most people saw their bill go up by more than 50% compared to what they were paying before, as there was this general equalization of local government taxation throughout the population. Now, it's worth, before we go on to the backlash, just to say now, fundamentally, that is part of the process of what Margaret Thatcher wanted to see happen. She wanted the base of the people contributing to the funding of local government to be increased so that people could see much more directly what they were paying, what they were getting for it, and hold the people who run councils to account for it. But the problem was, of course, the process of bringing that about was proving deeply, deeply unpopular. One of the key events around this time that reminded Tory MPs about quite how unpopular the policy was the Mid Staffordshire by-election. So this was brought about by the death of the former MP, took place in March of 1990, and what was a historic Conservative seat ended up having a Labour majority of just shy of 9,500. The Conservative vote share dropped by over 18% to less than a third, and Labour was knocking on the door of half of the vote. Lots of people attributed this outcome to the poll tax. This was really at the peak of the frenzy. This is around the same time as those riots, around the same time that people are getting prepared to stop paying their new bills. And so what ends up happening is an enormous internal debate breaks out inside Number 10, because what they're realizing is that rather than this line of accountability being drawn between county halls and the voter, instead people are bypassing the people who run their local councils, and they're putting the blame on Westminster and the government and the Prime Minister. So at least in the short term, we'll never quite know how this would have played out in the longer term. In the short term, it's the people who have introduced this model of taxation who are copying the blame for the levels of taxation, not the people who are setting the actual rate locally in their area.
So this is clearly very unpopular, and the Conservatives are experiencing a backlash. I think you're right to say, Lee, this is not just a backlash that people are seeing on their television screens or indeed participating in on the streets in the poll tax rebellions or riots, but also is demonstrating itself in parliamentary by-elections, in the local elections in 1990 as well. Does this therefore contribute to any change of heart about the policy, or did the Conservatives hold their nerve?
One slight caveat to the point about unpopularity actually we should make is that, as you say, in 1990 there were local elections. That included local elections in London, as there will be this May, for example. All the London councils will be up. Now, in early 1990, a lot of opinion polls showed Labour as much as 25% ahead. And in the local elections, the projected Labour lead was 11%. Not great, pretty awful. But
Well, depending on your perspective.
It's not great for the government, but much closer than many people thought. Similarly, people projected there would be 600 Conservative losses in those local elections, but the net losses ended up being 172. And in councils that had incredibly low levels of community charge, Conservative-run councils like Wandsworth and Westminster, still lauded now, decades on, for their relatively low levels of council tax. And it goes to show how some things in politics don't really change. In those councils, the Conservative majorities went up. The Conservatives were rewarded there for their low tax policies. And so in some ways, there are actually signs that maybe the policy was beginning to work as intended around accountability. And certainly people like Malcolm Rifkind, who was an Edinburgh MP, a member of the cabinet at the time, argued that in Scotland, where it had been introduced a year earlier, that you could begin to see signs of that more direct local accountability over taxation taking place, and that it just needed time to work. But the problem was that everybody expected at the time 1991 to be a general election year. Thatcher's previous terms had been 4 years. There would not be a huge amount of time for this really to take effect, for the whole policy to really play out. And MPs panicked, and therefore the government panicked. And basically, the core principles of the policy were gutted in 1990. And the government does that in the way in which it's been inclined to do in the past, basically by restricting and more tightly regulating what councils can charge people for local services. Chris Patten, who was the Environment Secretary at the time, basically announces that there will be caps. 20 councils in particular get their charge capped. All of them are run by the Labour Party. But again, just to return to this key point about accountability, well, the question then becomes, if you're actually limiting what a council like Haringey, a London council with a very, very high community charge, will charge its residents, then aren't you actually undermining the democratic accountability that's meant to be involved in this system? An argument that I think has even more punch, and this is a point made by Brian Gould that you can read in Hansard at the time in the debate with Chris Patten, is that he announces things like that cap in early April, just about a month before people are due to go to the polls in those very councils. So the public get a chance to have their say about it. But in response to panic on the Tory benches in particular, the policy gets capped. Later in 1990, Chris Patten then announces a multi-billion-pound package to cap the rises for the following year at £22, policy that will cost in money at the time about £3.5 billion. So by this stage, the government hasn't just introduced a new poll tax, a deeply unpopular tax, it's also setting the rate of it. So the entire logic behind the policy is basically in ruins.
It's a real mess. And it, I think, reflects, again, something of the government's underlying impulse about this, which was actually to cap the spending of Labour councils and B, to hold down the taxes of, in particular, I think, wealthier people living in Labour councils, who they saw as effectively victimised by these left-wing councils who were spending on things that the Conservative government did not think ought to see public money spent on. I think it's basically what's going on here, and that is revealed by Chris Patten's interventions. So Margaret Thatcher is forced out in November of 1990 by her own cabinet and a good chunk of her own MPs. To what extent, Lee, do you believe that the poll tax was a major contributing factor to her exit?
I think you get the poll tax, you get Europe, and then you get a sense of her hubris in office at the time. And I think each of those actually play crucial roles. It is Europe, for example, that triggers Geoffrey Howe to resign. And that's what triggers Michael Heseltine to make his challenge. And that's therefore what brings about the reality of that leadership election in 1990 that leads to her downfall.
Because you don't get resignations over the poll tax.
No, and its biggest internal critic, Nigel Lawson, has already gone for different reasons in 1989.
Right.
It's the poll tax which I think has contributed to huge amounts of discontent on the backbenches and a big panic. And by the time of the November 1990 leadership election, a lot of them think the general election is only 6 months away. So that's what's led to a lot of the discontent on the backbenchers. Alan Clark writes in his diaries around this time that he's talking to Tory MPs who are thinking of ditching her to save their seats. So that feeds into the context as well. And then I think it's the hubris question and the leadership failings by that stage, which basically mean that in the context of the campaign itself, she doesn't do what is required in order to actually win that leadership election. It becomes one of the most inept leadership campaigns ever, which is a tremendous irony, given that she becomes Conservative leader in 1975 with one of the most accomplished leadership campaigns ever to be moved at Heath. So I think you have to see all three of those things in combination, the Europe factor, the poll tax factor, and the hubris factor, as contributing to her particular downfall. But what her time as Prime Minister coming to an end guarantees is that the poll tax will go, effectively. So, of course, John Major wins the leadership election. He becomes Prime Minister. He brings Michael Heseltine, who's a big critic of the poll tax, makes ending it basically part of his pitch in his leadership election. Michael Heseltine is brought back into government, and quite quickly they announce that the policy is going to change. That rather comes in stages. So at one stage, they increase VAT, value added tax, from 15% to 17.5% in order to cover a £140 per person reduction in poll tax. Arguably, in that case, you're increasing one regressive tax in order to subsidize another regressive tax, but that's what they do. And then in March 1991, it was announced that the poll tax would go altogether and be replaced with a new system. And that legislation was importantly passed before the 1992 general election, with a new tax to come in 1993-94. So really the sting was taken out of the issue by the time of the 1992 general election. And then shortly after that, we end up with the model that we still have today, the also deeply flawed council tax.
Yeah, and council tax, I think, is very similar to the domestic rate system. So it's curious that after all of that palaver, after all of that heartache, after all of those green papers and debates and rows, effectively, we're back to a very similar system to the one that existed before Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, I think that's right. And if we extend and then maybe slightly abuse the opening metaphor about the pile of rocks on the beach, it's not just a case that try and move them and it collapses. Actually, it turns out that these rocks are basically just shy of being molten lava. Touch them and you get your fingers burned as well. Any major attempt to really reform local government funding in this country, and the poll tax is the real symbolic example of that, has ended in disaster. And it's why, even though now we've ended up with a system of council tax, which everybody knows is grossly unfair, if the idea of the Duke and the dustman paying the same was monstrous in the late 1980s, well, the idea now that a Mayfair townhouse pays less in council tax than a semi-detached in Blackpool is similarly outrageous, if not in some ways more outrageous, as a model of local government taxation. But there is a general fear of touching it because it is seen as being such a hot potato issue. And one of the things that I will say and commend Margaret Thatcher for is it's quite remarkable that even in her third term as Prime Minister, she was still willing to wrestle with very, very thorny issues. And she was willing to come up with solutions to what she saw as problems. Now, in this case, she came up with the wrong solution. The poll tax was fatally flawed because of its perceived and its actual unfairness. And in the end, it helped to end her premiership. But there is, nevertheless, I think, something quite admirable about the fact that she was willing to try and make these big arguments and push forward a reform and a change that she thought was justified. And it allows me to end on a point that I've made before, which is that this government will fiddle around the edges of council tax with this supposed mansion tax that it's introducing, but it will not fundamentally try and reform the issue, in spite of the fact that most Labour MPs know that the system as it is at the moment is a bad one. And so it rather begs the question, what is the point of having landslide majorities if you're not really willing to try and tackle some of the biggest and most complex problems that the country faces?
Well, I very much agree with that last point, Lee. I mean, this whole discussion underscores to me my pre-existing aversion to decentralized fiscal policy. And quite frankly, I would be much more comfortable with some kind of national property tax system that was common across the country based on the value of homes. And then the government just allocated a much larger grant to local government, where basically local government had very little say over the tax rates locally, and councillors were effectively elected to decide how to spend their central government grant. I'm sure there's lots of people who are advocates for local democracy, maybe even the chap next to me right now, the county councillor in the room, who take a different view. But I think that that would be a much more equitable and just system than the one that we currently have. We finish this podcast as we normally do with discussing books that we're reading at the moment, and I'll go first. This week, the book that I'd like to discuss is actually a book that I'm teaching at the moment. I've read this book actually now many times, but I thought I'd share it with our audience. It's called Liberalizing Lynching, Building a New Racialized State by Daniel Cato. Daniel Cato was lecturer on US politics at Queen Mary. He was, in fact, my immediate predecessor at Queen Mary before Daniel very sadly and suddenly died while he was working out as a young man. It was a very terrible and tragic loss. And Liberalizing Lynching is his book, which describes the US federal government's response to racialized violence in the country from the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights era, so from the sort of 1860s to the 1960s, when there were thousands of incidents of ordinary African American men and women, and actually in some cases white people who also supported Black equality, who were killed by mobs, often on the grounds of some kind of claim of a crime that was accused against them, usually a spurious claim of a crime, and certainly not dealt in the way that a fair and equitable system of justice would respond to those alleged crimes by having someone tried, but by killing people, usually through public spectacle. Absolutely awful and dark part of American history. And this book is about why did the federal government not intervene to stop this from happening? Because what was happening was that, again, it shows the dangers of localism. Local police officers, local judges, state government officials just turned a blind eye to all of this and allowed the perpetrators of these murders to get away with it. And Cato says, why didn't the central state actually step in and do something about it? And there's long been an argument that the American federal government didn't have the capacity to do it and didn't have the legality to do it. So on the capacity, they didn't have the agents to go in to the South and other parts of the US where lynchings happen, because they didn't just happen in the South, and bring the peace. And the other is that even if the federal government wanted to do that, it couldn't. And what Cato shows in his book is that both of those claims are wrong, that the federal government did have the capacity, if it had wished to exercise it, to bring peace, basically, to these places of racial violence in the United States. And secondly, the federal government knew that it had legal basis to do that, but it chose not to. And it chose to indulge in a legal fiction where it claimed that its hands were tied when it wasn't. And Cato finds very rare for a piece of archival research, effectively smoking gun evidence, written evidence, where legal officials in the White House during the Franklin Roosevelt era basically back up this point that he's making. So it's a great book. It's a wonderful legacy to a brilliant scholar whose life ended far too young, and I recommend it to our listeners. Lee, what is the book that you are reading at the moment?
So this week I've read The Road to the Scottish Parliament by Brian Taylor. And this is a book that basically charts the way in which devolution came about in Scotland, predictably enough, given its title, by looking at the arguments that, actually some of which were emerging in the 1980s, some of which go further back, which began to consolidate into the 1990s, and discusses in quite a bit of detail. It's not a very long book, but it's really quite illuminating about lots of the debates and things that were seemingly important at the time that are quite easy to forget now as we look back on devolution more than a quarter of a century on. So, for example, some of the things that he discusses in the book are questions about whether or not to have a referendum and what the referendum should be. Now, there were two questions put to the ballot in the referendum in 1997, one about having devolution itself and another about tax rising powers, the so-called tartan tax, as some people referred to it at the time. And there were great debates within the Labour Party as well as beyond it about that. One of the names that comes up on page 79 is a Mohammed Sarwar, then a Glasgow councillor and later to be an MP in Glasgow, and the father of the current leader of the Scottish Labour Party, who hopes to become First Minister this year. There were other things that are really interesting in here that I took a lot of interest in. For example, about the way in which the Scottish nationalists viewed devolution. Historically, there was great scepticism in the Scottish nationalist movement about devolution. They had traditionally thought it was a way in which Scottish opinion would be pandered to, and which would actually make independence itself less likely, almost taking a Leninist view about the working class in the way it's sometimes described, that actually if you ameliorate the status of the working class, it makes them less inclined towards revolution. The view of lots of nationalists were, well, if you devolve power to Scotland, it makes them less inclined towards independence. Alex Salmond is a critical figure in recognizing that actually devolution isn't the thing which would prevent independence. It's actually a stepping stone to it. And this is how you convince more people that Scotland should be self-governing, to make it partial self-governing. I think Alex Salmond's line of thinking there has been proven much more accurate than those within the Labour Party who rather arrogantly said that devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. It actually put rocket launchers under Scottish nationalism, and we're still living with the consequences of it. So, like I said, this is a relatively short book. It's only about 180 pages or so, but it's really readable. It's highly readable. Brian Taylor, as many people will know, was the political editor of BBC Scotland. So he doesn't write a dry book. He actually writes a book that is steeped in the politics and the debates and the challenges of the time. So yes, I'd highly recommend giving it a read if you're interested in how the Scottish Parliament came about. That's all for this week's episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. If you've got other topics you'd like us to discuss, in particular if you're a member of our Patreon, one of the perks we hope is that we can be responsive to your requests. Please do let us know about what you think we should be talking about on the podcast. Otherwise, we'll be back on Thursday with our next midweek Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.